So we're going to first kind of continue the theme of responding to abuse, only just kind of having to look at the concept of whistleblowing, essentially, and why it's an important kind of almost moral duty to blow the whistle on any even slightly suspected issues that you might have about abuse or neglect. We're then going to start along the lines of preventing abuse. What kind of factors might, prevent it from happening in the first place, which is always going to be your priority. You want to prevent it from happening before you respond to it actually happening. So I just want us to point out where this will go in terms of criteria. So first we have to consider that some of this is going to be included in those factors of preventing abuse, that kind of, pass criteria in terms of explaining what it is that we do to prevent abuse in terms of the factors that, because the criteria is factors that make it more likely, but also factors which make it less likely. So a lot of the stuff we talk about preventing abuse goes in there, and I'll make that clearer probably later on. But then we have the criteria for responding to abuse as well, actually explaining the responses that we make. And again, a lot of that is going to also factor in. So whistleblowing, for example, is a response to abuse that would go into that criteria. But in all of these, we can weave in the distinction criteria, which is actually justifying all of what we're talking about. In order to get the distinction criteria, all you have to do is explain what the response is that prevents abuse, or the response that we make to abuse once it happens. Really, to get this, the distinction, all you have to do is explain why we take that response, why we make that measure to prevent it. As long as you kind of understand why that measure is there, then as long as you've written that down sufficiently in your assignment, you will get the distinction. So just bear in mind that all of these pass criteria are linked to the distinction criteria. It's just an extra layer of detail, if you like. One manner in which we respond to abusive behaviour or practices within an institution is something called whistleblowing, which is essentially the reporting of immoral or illegal activity within a care setting by other staff, possibly to a higher authority. This is known as whistleblowing, and actually many people may be afraid of being a whistleblower. They may be afraid of the person that they are reporting. They may be afraid that something might not happen even if they do, or if they like the person, they may not want them to actually get into trouble. So there are a number of reasons why people may not want to blow the whistle on abusive practices. But it is important to remember that as part of the duty of care to patients, that bad practice must be reported, because bad practice continues when it is left unreported. In fact, the longer that bad practice goes unreported, the likelier it gets that that bad practice will get worse. Because of the issues that it causes, it's sometimes impossible for whistleblowers actually to continue working in the organisation they've blown the whistle in, and often they may have to find work elsewhere. But still, they have to make sure that they do go ahead and blow the whistle on any potential immoral or illegal activity. This is a central part of the duty of care, and it ensures that no institution is allowed to continue with its bad practice. So that's the last of the kind of major responses to abuse. Whistleblowing is a really interesting element because it's one thing which is a legal and a moral duty to do, but is at the same time something which actually almost makes it impossible for you to continue working at an institution, because of the breakdown in at least the potential breakdown between workers as an organisation that can result. So it is, in many ways something which people are afraid to do because of that potential for damaging your work relations. But again, for our distinction criteria, we have to justify why whistleblowing is a necessary and important thing for people to do when they notice abuse. And it's because essentially, if abuse goes unnoticed or unreported, it will continue and it will get worse, is the reality. Abusers, when they get away with something, or people when they're getting away with neglecting, aren't going to stop if it goes unreported. There's no reason to suggest they might. So really, whistleblowing is a moral and a legal duty for any care worker. But now we're going to look forward to preventing abuse. These are things that we can do and responses that we can take before anything bad happens to stop it happening in the first place. And again, for that distinction criteria, make sure we understand why these measures are in place. One of the most important things in reducing the likelihood of abuse and neglect is identifying the individuals that will be most at risk from abuse or neglect. Consider the factors of vulnerability that we looked at in previous lessons. Who do you think will be most susceptible to abusive practice? Often, abusers will know to keep their activity away from care workers, so you need to know how to spot changes in behaviour or physical signs of abuse and neglect amongst these people. You should be vigilant across everyone, of course, but it's important to identify certain individuals that may be less likely to report it themselves. Changes in behaviour that you notice should be documented in the service users' files for all other care workers to see, so that you can establish a long-term observation of their behaviour and identify any significant changes. These significant changes could be signs of abuse or neglect and should never be ignored. The next factor of reducing abuse and neglect is to raise awareness, but also to provide information and advocacy. Vulnerable people may be unaware that they are at risk of being abused. They may maintain strong relationships with people that are abusing them because they fear being alone. So it's really important that institutions raise awareness and that they give and distribute information to their service users about the risks that are posed to them, so that they are always vigilant for it. But also, these service users may be unaware that certain individuals pose a risk. They may be socially unaware and may be likely to comply with abusers' instructions, so they should be informed of their rights and what they should and should not do in care settings. Information should be widely distributed so that service users are informed of their position. Another aspect of preventing abuse has been the so-called no secrets policy. This was essentially an aspect of policy that was later melded into the Care Act of 2014, and it roughly says that basically we should have a system in which organisations are transferring information about individuals who may be at risk of abuse or neglect. This is to basically make sure that no one can be possibly cut off by any single institution, that everyone has been kept in the loop, that no one is isolated from the people that need to help them. But it's an important aspect of interagency collaboration like this that you actually make sure that when you are making a disclosure about someone that you believe to be at risk of abuse and neglect, you must remember that you are talking to a person that actually has a right to that information. You must make sure that you're not disclosing anyone's confidential information to someone that shouldn't be having it. If you're in doubt, you must ask your line manager. So again, we've already talked about this important need for interagency collaboration of all of the agencies involved around an individual working together to basically make sure that we have the fullest picture possible about someone's life and their state of their care. If you just rely on one organisation to care for an individual or to look into them or to make sure that they're okay, then if they are forced or if they by their own volition cut off contact with that organisation, then you're left helpless. But if you can, almost, it sounds sinister in a way, but surround an individual with all sorts of organisations and agencies that are sharing information about them, then we can make sure that that person can't be isolated, that there is some point of contact with the care community and the wider society around them that ensures that they aren't threatened by some of the issues of abuse and neglect that we've talked about. But also I want to consider that now we're going to look at some rules and guidelines, and the importance of rules and guidelines for abuse and neglect. And again, for our distinction criteria, bear in mind that rules and guidelines are important in knowing the criteria in which you measure someone. If we don't have rules and guidelines, and there isn't a clear way where we can tell that something is not sufficient, that something has slipped below minimum standards, and we also, if we don't have rules and guidelines, then people will not know how to act, and there isn't a standardized way of approaching things. If everyone's got kind of different safeguarding policies here and there, then that creates all sorts of confusion, and it creates a lot of lack of clarity. So rules and guidelines really tell us how we should act, what constitutes bad practice, and if we've got clear rules and guidelines across the health and social care sector, we can move from one place to another, and we can know concretely that this is good practice, that's bad practice. So just bear in mind that that's really the kind of benefit of a lot of this. And a lot of the content I'm about to go through is basically, how do we make sure that everyone's on board with that? How do we make sure that everyone knows the rules and the guidelines for their particular organisation? Another aspect of preventing abuse is obviously legislation and regulations. It's important to define what these two things mean. Legislation refers to a law or an act of Parliament, whereas regulations are more low-level rules and directives, normally part of the organisation that you're working for. Laws and regulations will help you to perform your role safely and effectively by making sure that there are clear guidelines for what is and isn't acceptable in your practice. For instance, you and your employer are guided by and protected by the Health and Safety at Work Act of 1974. This sets, by law, legal requirements for safe working environments so that everyone is sure what the minimum standards are for a working care environment. All care settings are subject to some degree of control by legislation. You will need to be aware of the policies and procedures in your place of work, not only to protect you as a worker, but also so that you are clear of what to look out for when someone is perhaps being neglected, because you will know what the minimum standards are, and if they are being slipped underneath, you know to point it out. Of course, a big aspect of this is also staff training. A vital part in preventing abuse and neglect is how the staff are trained and developed. As part of your induction, you should get an introduction to the place of work's policies regarding safeguarding and protection against abuse. This should be one of the very first things that's done when you arrive at the workplace. If not, the employer is failing in its duty of care, both to the service users and you. Everyone working in that environment must be aware of the relevant safeguarding policies and what to do in the event of abuse and neglect. However, basic training will not be sufficient, as legislation and regulations will change very frequently. Therefore, you will need what is called continued professional development to keep you up to speed. This ensures that all of the workers in an institution are updated as to the changes in legislation and regulations, but also updated as to any improvements that have been made into the way that they carry out safeguarding policy. Therefore, both the initial training and the continued professional development will help to keep service users and workers safe at work.